It's time for episode 10 of the Mystical Times blog podcast. In this episode, I'll be sharing 2 spooky experiences of Phantom Hitch Hikers that have happened in the UK. Imagine you are driving along a lonely road at night and see a single figure on the roadside wanting a lift. You take pity on them, so decide to stop and offer them a lift. They accept your offer, but then things start to take a very odd turn indeed. Now you see him, now you don't. The A38 is a road that runs from Derby all the way to Cornwall, and there is a 10-mile section of the road in the county of Somerset that's had many sightings of a hitchhiker who would always be described as a middle-aged man wearing a long light-coloured overcoat whilst holding a torch downwards. He would sometimes appear in the middle of the road so that when a lone driver would see him, they would swerve so not to hit him, but the man was nowhere to be seen when the driver stopped their car and checked their mirrors. On one occasion, it was a motorcyclist who, upon seeing the figure in the road, swerved too abruptly, fell off and broke a limb. These incidents were reported to a local Somerset newspaper in the early 1970s, and a man, a Mr Unsworth, contacted the newspaper to tell of his strange encounters with this phantom hitchhiker that had occurred in the 1950s. Mr Unsworth had been a lorry driver, and the A38 was a road he regularly drove on in the early hours of the morning. He was rather embarrassed to tell of his experiences, but felt he needed to. It was around 3 a.m. and Mr Unsworth was driving back to his depot on the A38. The weather that morning was wet and damp when Mr Unsworth saw a man trying to flag down a lift. This man looked soaked to the bone as his longish greyish hair was dripping with water. He was wearing a light-coloured overcoat and carrying a torch, so Mr Unsworth saw him and stopped his lorry to offer this man a lift. The hitchhiker spoke with a well-educated accent and asked Mr Unsworth to drop him off by a bridge, which was around 4 miles away. As they travelled along, the hitchhiker began talking about accidents that had happened at this bridge. He spoke about these gruesome accidents in a gleeful tone, and Mr Unsworth was glad when the hitchhiker finally got out the lorry. It was several days later when Mr Unsworth was travelling on the A38 at 3 a.m. on a wet and cold morning. As he approached a stretch of road where he had previously picked up the hitchhiker, he was shocked to see the man again, trying to flag down a lift. For whatever reason, Mr Unsworth gave this man a lift to the same bridge as the first time. Yet again, this man held the same strange conversation about accidents at the bridge and spoke about it in the same gleeful tone. This was to happen a third time, and Mr Unsworth felt the man was mentally disturbed due to hitchhiking in such foul weather in the early hours of the morning, and to talk about such harrowing accidents. He was relieved not to see the figure again in the following months. That was until an early, murky and rainy morning in November. Mr Unsworth gave him yet another lift. Mr Unsworth felt this was becoming rather odd, but this time the hitchhiker asked if Mr Unsworth could wait at the bridge for him, as he had a few things he needed to collect and wanted to travel a few miles further after these items had been collected. So Mr Unsworth let out the hitchhiker and waited. He waited a good while, but the hitchhiker hadn't returned, so Mr Unsworth decided to leave. He had gone 3 miles up the A38 when, all of a sudden, he saw the man he had dropped off at the bridge. There was no mistaking his overcoat, hair and torch. Mr Unsworth thought it would have been impossible for the man to cover the 3-mile distance on foot alone, and he had not seen any other cars on the road since dropping the hitchhiker off. Mr Unsworth gave this man a wide berth, and as he did so, the man jumped right in front of the lorry, so the lorry had to swerve, and Mr Unsworth managed to keep his lorry under control. He stopped the lorry and got out. What he saw was the figure of the hitchhiker on the road, shaking his fists and swearing out loud. Mr Unsworth quickly got back in his lorry, feeling the need for some sort of normality, as this situation didn't make any sense. Fortunately, Mr Unsworth was never to see this hitchhiker again. The A38 has had many fatal accidents over the years, so just who is this phantom hitchhiker? Just be extra careful if you ever find yourself driving down a lonely stretch of the A38 in Somerset in the dark. The Silent Hitchhiker. It was on the evening of the 12th of October 1979 when a 26-year-old man called Roy Fulton had been playing in a darts match in Leighton Buzzard, Bedfordshire. When the match had finished, it was around 9:15, so Roy got into his van and within 5 minutes he was driving down Pedlar's Lane in Stanbridge. Only part of that lane had street lighting, and when Roy entered the dark part of the lane, he saw the figure of a young man who was standing on the left side of the road and was thumbing a lift. The young man had dark hair and was wearing an open-collar white shirt with dark trousers. Roy was later to say that the young man's face was rather pale, and his face was elongated in appearance. Roy stopped several feet ahead of the young man hitchhiking, so the hitchhiker walked up to Roy's van, opened the passenger door, the interior light came on, and the man promptly sat in the passenger seat. Roy asked him where he wanted to go, and the young man just pointed ahead. Roy assumed he wanted to go to either Dunstable or Tottenham, as both were in that direction, so Roy drove off with his passenger. It was around 2 to 3 minutes later that Roy wanted a smoke, so offered his silent passenger a cigarette. As he turned to ask him, he saw that no one was in the van. Roy was totally alone. Roy slammed on the brakes and checked all around the van to see if the young man had somehow got into the back, but no, he wasn't to be seen anywhere in the van. Roy came over with a cold panic, but managed to grip the steering wheel with sweaty hands and put his foot down and sped away. Roy made his way to a nearby pub that he knew, and one of the barmen remarked to Roy that he looked as though he had seen a ghost, to which Roy replied that he had. He found himself telling the patrons for the bar what just happened, even though he was still in shock. Once he had calmed down enough, he went to the local police station to report the incident there. The police were later to confirm that Roy hadn't appeared as though he were drunk. Roy wanted the police to know what had happened just in case the young man had been flesh and blood and had come to any harm. The police sent a car to where the incident had happened, but could find no evidence of anyone coming to any harm, so they closed the case. So just who had Roy picked up that fateful night? There were no historical reports of a young man fitting the description of the phantom hitchhiker having an accident on that road, so it still remains a mystery. That's all for episode 10, and I do hope you enjoyed those phantom hitchhiker experiences. If you've had a spooky experience, then please email me at mysticaltimesblog@gmail.com. For episode 11, I'll be sharing 2 mediumistic readings that I gave, and both had strange and spooky endings to them. Till next time.